Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please take your seats as we're going to begin very shortly. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I thank you all for coming this morning, and thank you in particular to Onward for authoring this fabulous report. So let me start by saying that climate change is real. We can see its effects in changing weather patterns and extreme weather all over the world. The argument that we need to have is not about whether we should respond, but whether the policies we have chosen are actually working, especially our energy policy. I want to set out a better way, cleaner, cheaper, and more reliable power. Our mission is abundant energy, built around nuclear, renewables, and gas, protecting both our economy and our environment. No one understands the problems with Britain's energy system better than your next speaker, the Right Honourable Claire Coutinho. Good energy policy should cut emissions, protect our natural environment, and make Britain more resilient. It should not make electricity so expensive that families cannot afford it, businesses move production overseas, and we become more dependent on countries with lower environmental standards. A problem at the heart of British energy policy is that we have pursued ever cleaner electricity without asking enough about the cost of the whole system. The result is some of the most expensive electricity in the developed world. As Energy Secretary, Claire saw firsthand where the system was going wrong. Since then, she and her team have put thousands of hours into understanding what has driven up electricity costs, what needs to change, and how we can bring bills down for families and businesses. And that matters, because Conservatives have not always got this right. Mistakes have been made. But recognising a mistake is only useful if you are prepared to fix it. And that is what this new Conservative Party, this different generation of Conservatives, is determined to do. There is a lot of political noise about energy. What Claire has been doing is the serious work, looking at the evidence, understanding the costs. Even though she's 7 months pregnant, she's still doing it, and working out what a better system would actually look like. That is how we will get Britain working again. So I am delighted to introduce my friend and our Shadow Energy Secretary, Claire Coutinho.
Thank you. Countries around the world have proven over and over again that the two most important drivers for economic growth are cheap, abundant energy and economic freedom. That's why one of the biggest problems that we face in Britain today is the fact that we have the highest electricity prices in the developed world. There is simply no such thing as a high-growth, low-energy country. And as our electricity has got cleaner, it's also got more expensive. That means we are using less of it, just as the rest of the world is using more. Our expensive electricity is pushing our industry overseas. It's harming our ambitions in AI, and it's hurting living standards. These things are widely acknowledged. But what people don't admit is that expensive electricity is bad for the environment too. Over the summer, climate policy has been in the news. It's been said by some that we are in denial. But we Conservatives are not in denial about climate change. It's the left who are in denial about the fact that their climate policy is failing. Look at where our emissions actually come from now. Just 10% of our emissions come from our electricity grid. Over 90% come from transport, heating, and elsewhere in the economy. There is simply no point having the cleanest electricity in the world if nobody in Britain can afford to use it. If you want to cut emissions, then you need people to want electric cars and electric heating. And for that, your number one priority should be to make electricity cheap. But net zero legislation has forced us to do the opposite. In fact, Ed Miliband's Clean Power 2030 target is intent on squeezing every last drop of carbon out of our electricity, no matter the cost. But making electricity expensive puts electrification out of reach for ordinary families. It's moving our industry to more polluting countries overseas, forcing us to import back those same goods with higher emissions. That is not improving the climate. It's madness, especially when electrification is a far bigger prize than perfectly clean electricity when it comes to reducing emissions. There are some who will say that the cost is worth it because it gives us climate leadership. But our high electricity prices are not convincing any other countries to follow our lead. In fact, it's our hot and heavy pursuit of net zero that is giving the others the ick. The difference between us and other parties is that we want a climate policy to work for the economy and for the environment. That's why we're the only party to call for the measurement of offshoring of emissions. That's why we think the best way to help people adopt clean tech is not endless bans and mandates and subsidies, but to make it work for consumers. Rather than forcing people to do what we want, our job as politicians should be to lift the barriers in their way. That's why we believe we should focus all of our attention on making electricity cheap and then let consumer choice be king. That is the only approach that will work in the long term. That's why, for the economy or for the environment, cheap electricity is the holy grail. But first, let me explain how we got here. Back in 2023, I had just been appointed Energy Secretary in the last Conservative government. A few weeks in, I asked civil servants what I thought was a simple question. Prove to me that renewables are cheap. Like all of you, I'd heard people saying that for years. But to my astonishment, they could not prove it. Our entire energy policy was based on this promise that all this wind and solar was going to cut bills. And yet, when I combed through the spreadsheets put in front of me, I realized that they didn't have the evidence there to back it up. The truth is that too much wind and solar creates all of these extra hidden costs. It's like a Ryanair flight. The ticket might look cheap, but once you've paid for a bag, a seat, and a sandwich, you realize you've been stung. We are going to pay billions to switch wind farms off when it's too windy, billions for expensive backup when it's not windy enough, tens of billions for the hundreds of miles of extra pylons needed to connect all of these extra panels and turbines into the grid. Cost after cost after cost. And all of that is landing on people's energy bills. So I asked the department to get to work and do a proper analysis of all of these extra costs. But then we had an election, and Ed Miliband cancelled that work. Either he didn't want to know the truth, or he didn't care. And the truth is, Labour's £300 energy bills promise was only ever a number to get them through an election trail. And far from bills going down by £300, since the election, bills have gone up by £300 instead. Which brings me to why we are all here today. For me, this is unfinished business. This is why I asked Kemi if I could stay in the energy brief after the election. 2 years after Ed Miliband cancelled the true costing of renewables that I started, Onward have stepped in to finish the job. This is the single most detailed costing of the electricity system that has ever been produced in British politics. And the findings are remarkable. It shows that we can save consumers over £320 billion on their electricity bills by 2050 if we prioritise cheap electricity over a net zero grid dominated by wind and solar. And we'd still have electricity which is nearly 80% clean at the end of it. That's the equivalent savings of £540 per British household per year for the next 2 decades. This is the work that should have been done by government, but has not been, because they're more driven by ideology than they are by evidence. I want to thank the author, Ed Heslett, who is one of the most remarkable minds emerging in energy policy today, and Marlon Day and his team at Transera Energy for carrying out the extensive modelling behind this report. The cheap power system prioritises costs. It has a bit more gas, it triples our nuclear power, and it has far fewer wind and solar farms, and it gets rid of the carbon tax. So where do the savings come from? Roughly half the savings come from having to build much less grid, fewer pylons and less cables carving up the countryside. The rest of the savings come from lower wholesale prices, lower balancing costs, and subsidies. Basically, we'd pay a lot less money to switch wind farms off when it's too windy, or for backup when it's not windy enough. This is important because the government is currently running another auction round for renewables. In the last one, Ed Miliband signed up to the highest cost of offshore wind in a decade, and this one is set to be no cheaper. But to decide whether we should be locking ourselves into these contracts, which last for 20 years, we should know whether or not they're going to make our electricity system cheaper. The average electricity price so far this year is £97 per megawatt hour. The Climate Change Committee thinks the cost of offshore wind is £38 per megawatt hour. The Department for Energy thinks that it's £100 per megawatt hour. But if you actually add up all the extra costs that wind and solar add to the system, then it should be seen as closer to £230 per megawatt hour. Whichever way you look at it, that is eye-wateringly expensive. If cheap electricity is the holy grail, then we should do everything we can to achieve it. Our cheap power plan set out last year would help in the immediate term. It would cut VAT off energy bills, axe the carbon tax, and scrap outdated wind subsidies, and it could save households £200 immediately. For the long term, this report shows why we should abolish counterproductive net zero legislation pushing us towards more expensive electricity. We would adopt the Fingleton Review to build nuclear much, much more cheaply. We would allow for new gas power to keep the lights on, and we would keep zonal pricing on the table if it can cut bills. We'd auction large grid connections to get big users connected quickly, and we'd bring competition into building transmission infrastructure. But above all, we would rewire energy policy to make electricity cheap again. The truth is that our problems in energy are a symptom of something wider in politics. We've handed more and more of our powers to unaccountable bodies who pay no price for being wrong. Too much of politics has become interested in the optics than doing the hard yards of working out the best route for the country and then seeking to persuade. That's why we end up with Andy Burnham shirking decisions on the North Sea, even though he knows our homegrown gas is much cleaner than importing high-emission gas from abroad. If civil servants tell politicians that renewables are cheap when they aren't, then we are going to make bad decisions. When the Climate Change Committee gets their costing for offshore wind for the latest carbon budget wrong by a factor of 300%, they face no repercussions. Ofgem are supposed to be the consumer watchdog, and yet they pay no penalties when bills go up and up and up. Our grid operator is so reluctant to face the truth that renewables are making our grid unstable that its own control room operators had to come to me this summer to make their concerns heard. And on it goes. Our bills are going up and up and up, and nobody seems to be in charge. We have to bring back pragmatism and accountability to our energy policy making. This is not about turning our back on our duty to provide the next generation with a better environment. The Burkean contract between the living and those yet to be born is a core conservative principle which we should never abandon. But while the Labour Party will promise you £300 off your bills that they will never deliver, and Reform think repeatedly saying net stupid zero is enough of a plan to cut bills, ours is the case for a serious energy policy that works for the climate and for the consumer. I believe Kemi Badenoch is the only political leader in Britain with the courage, the conviction, and the intellectual rigour to create the radical overhaul of energy policy that we need. This much-needed report demonstrates that we can have both economic prosperity and a better environment if we make electricity cheap, let the economy grow, and make consumer choice king. That is the serious choice, that's the optimistic choice, and that's what the next Conservative government will deliver. Thank you.
Right, I've got 10 minutes and a few slides, so I'll get going. Thank you, Claire. Just before starting, I think it's worth discussing the emissions metrics that the UK actually uses. So all of the net zero stats are based on territorial emissions, so the carbon and greenhouse gas emissions that come from within our borders. And that's reduced by about 50% since 1990. There is another measure called consumption emissions, which takes into account the emissions in imported goods and services too. And that's down by about a quarter since 1990. So we have made good progress on both, but some of it has come from offshoring. But back to the territorial stats that everyone uses. So this chart in blue shows you the remaining emissions by sector, and the green is the progress we've made since 1990. To Claire's point, the electricity supply sector is now just 10% of our remaining territorial emissions and reduced by 82% since the levels of 1990. The big blue blocks that are left to attack are domestic transport and building and product uses, which is mainly heating our buildings. So those two chunks are about half of our remaining emissions. Now, the great news is we have wonderfully efficient electrification technologies in the form of heat pumps and electric vehicles that can make massive dents in those emissions. So those technologies, even on the grid of 2025, would reduce emissions by about 80% rather than the fossil fuel alternatives. And so what's the plan for delivering this? How do we get consumers to adopt this? Well, my worldview is you put your faith in the savvy British public. So these charts are market share data for EVs on the left and petrol cars on the right. And I've coloured the bars differently for months after March 2026, so post the fuel price spikes associated with Hormuz. And you can see a definite change in trend, indicating that consumers will vote with their wallet and adopt the technologies if the economics make sense for them. And we don't just have to look at UK consumers. This is European data. So on the bottom axis, we're looking at the electricity to gas price ratio. So how expensive is electricity relative to gas, with the more expensive on the right. And on the vertical axis, that's the market share of heat pump sales. And surprise, surprise, the country with the highest electricity to gas price ratio has both the lowest market share of heat pump sales and the lowest installed base. That's our country, the UK. And there's a reason I focus on heat in particular, as I think electrifying that is the much more difficult policy problem of the two. At the end of the day, an EV is a battery on wheels. Those of you with driveways, you have a wide choice of which hours to charge it in. Heat demand is likely to be a much bigger correlated spike between the population. We all want our heating to be on the very coldest days. And so I thought about inverting the problem. How would you try and minimise heat pump adoption if you wanted to in the UK? Firstly, I'd make electricity really expensive relative to gas. You've got to work quite hard because heat pumps are pretty efficient, probably 3.5 times efficient as a gas boiler. So I'd probably want a ratio of about 3.5 to 4 times to get there. I'd then get the public a little bit concerned about the decline of reliable capacity for the winter months, just so that there's a bit of concern about moving away from their trusty gas boiler. And thirdly, I'd say if you can have any features that make your life better, like cooling in the summer, we're going to make the state quite hostile to those. You can have features like the extra large water tank that you don't have on a combi boiler, but anything positive will just make sure that that's discouraged. And we're doing all three of these things. And you can even test it. You can then give a £7,500 subsidy, 8 years of free heating and measure your uptake. And I think it was like something like 52,000 heat pump retrofits versus a market of 23 million gas boilers installed. Now, the trouble for Britain is we have something called a winter peaking grid. Our electricity demand in the shaded blue there peaks in the winter months. And if we're serious about electrifying heating, I expect that bias probably to get larger, if anything. It's a shame because solar technology is amazing and will change the global picture of energy. But we're very far north and most of our solar generation occurs in the summer months, the inverse of our electricity demand. It is a bit windier in the winter months than summer, but we have the problem of generation lulls. So in the red circle there, that's a week-long generation lull in wind production, which means if you do connect loads of wind to the grid, you also need a reliable backup source as well. That's something of a problem in the UK. We haven't been lazy on connecting new capacity to the grid. In fact, it's continued to rise consistently, but the amount of firm generation capacity has fallen by nearly 40% since 2010. And so this is really the core argument at the heart of the report. If you can make electricity cheap and reliable, then you've got a much better chance of consumers adopting these technologies. And I'll give a bit of insight into sort of the drivers behind the network costs, which are nearly half of the savings in the plan. Just to introduce the proposed electricity mix in the power plan as well, it's not one of climate denialism. Wind actually remains the biggest category in 2050. There's then about a third nuclear, a decent slug of solar, and then a remaining quantity of gas. But I think this chart shows you why the grid build-out requirement is so much lower. So the power plan on the right, because you're using nuclear, because you're retaining some gas, means you need to connect much less in the way of new capacity for a similar amount of electricity generated. In fact, the gap between that bar in 2050 is nearly 80 gigawatts, which is about the size of the generation capacity that was on the grid in the year 2000. So you're avoiding connecting the grid of the millennium. And the end result of all those four savings categories is that you end up with a cheaper power system that we model as 17% cheaper by 2035 and more like 20% cheaper from 2040 onwards. In turn, that makes technologies like heat pumps deliver savings that households can actually get behind and lead to the adoption of those technologies via consumer preference and not state mandate. Now, I think if we learned anything over the last few years, you don't want to trust a person called Ed to centrally plan your energy system. And so I'm not advocating that my plan or the Onward plan is a perfect blueprint for the UK. The broader point is that intermittent technologies do come with integration costs that aren't being properly allocated back to the causative technologies. So on transmission charging, something like 90% of the wider transmission charging goes to consumer bills and not to generators. That weakens the locational signal as to where generators could site their plant. On balancing costs, we're paying billions, but if you move to a nodal or zonal pricing system, then if you get a glut in a particular area, instead of that cost being transferred to bills, the wholesale price crashes and the generators pay the price. And on electricity networks as well, look, we're going to have to build more grid if we want electrification to succeed, but we can also get the very most out of what we already have. Technologies like dynamic line rating allow more electricity to go through the grid when it's cold and windy. If you put batteries in networks, they can act as a buffer and increase the utilization of wires. And we could also change the incentives for electricity networks. Rather than just incentivizing them on how much they build, you could start to incentivize them based on how much power they can deliver for what they have built. Anyway, that's the end of the questions, and happy to take any Q&A.
Great. Is this on? I'm not sure. Is this? Yeah, that seems to be working. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you to Ed for making that interesting. Thank you to all the non-specialist press for sitting through your energy lecture. We're going to start with Joe Pike from BBC News.
Thank you, Joe Pike from BBC News. Really interesting presentations. Thank you for them. The other party that, of course, have been speaking about net zero policy this week is Reform UK. I wonder, Claire Coutinho, if you could explain to us why your plan is better than arguably their more radical solution to all of this.
I mean, what is their solution? They think they can just say net stupid zero and that's a plan. It isn't. And what you've got at the moment in British politics is you've got the left who have their head in the sands that their climate policy is failing. They're not even recognising that fact. And then you've got Reform, who think they can just come up with a political slogan and that's enough to rewire an entire energy system. We are the only political party who is actually doing the proper work to understand how we can make electricity cheaper for ordinary families. Next, David Lynch from PA.
Hello there, David from PA. Just wanted to ask, your plans, I'm just having a look at the Onward report. You've got gas usage, it's going up in terawatt hours into the 2050s. Do you think there's any, let me try and rephrase that, sorry. So basically, do you think there's value in reaching net zero at some point in the future, in decarbonising the grid entirely at some point? And secondly, just while we've been sat here, I had something come in via email. I'm reliably informed by Ladbrokes that Kemi is now the favourite in the betting odds to be the next Prime Minister. What do you make of that? And do you think that's a deserved prediction given the last 14-year period you had in power as well? Thank you.
I think it's an entirely deserved prediction. And like I said in my speech, I think she is the only political leader who is showing the conviction, the courage and the intellectual rigour to fix some of the country's biggest challenges. I think she's the only political leader showing a moral compass at the moment in politics. And so I do think it's entirely deserved. In terms of reaching net zero, the problem is we don't want to live in a fantasy land. We want something which works for the economy and the environment. If you got to an 80% reduction of emissions and much higher living standards, surely that's better for all. And you have to remember that the world is watching us. If we continue to decarbonise, but we make people's lives worse, then the 99% of emissions which don't happen in Britain will not be reduced, because people will look to us and say, that is not an example we want to follow. That's a warning of what we should not do. Claire from the Daily Mail.
Thank you. Could I ask if you agree with Dale Vince that we need to introduce wholesale energy price controls? And could I also ask whether, if the Tories come back to power, they would continue to use the Drax biofuel power station? Thank you.
Well, where I do, surprisingly for once, agree with Dale is I think this week he said we should sign off Jackdaw and Rosebank, which is an extraordinary turnaround for someone who used to fund Just Stop Oil. And I think what that means, you're seeing, is people are starting to turn towards energy realism. And a lot of the people who threw rocks at us for saying this for years, I mean, bear in mind, I was legislating to protect North Sea oil and gas licenses when I was Secretary of State, are finally coming around to the reality that it's better for jobs, it's better for the economy, and it's better for the environment because it has far fewer emissions than the dirtier gas that we would import from abroad. The next one is Tom from The Sun. Oh, so in terms of Drax, what we want to see is reliable power that is as cheap as possible. And if you look at what we set out in the report, we want to see much more nuclear and more gas in the system. And you can still have 80% clean electricity overall. I think that is what we are working towards, making sure we can have a system which is as cheap as possible and as clean as possible. Tom from The Sun.
Thank you. Kemi Badenoch has said that Britain should exploit its own energy resources, having previously said she would leave the door open to fracking. Would a Conservative government lift the moratorium on fracking? And just a second quick follow-up, if I may. You said that your plans were more detailed than Reform, but would you leave the door open to working with Reform in a potential hung parliament on fracking?
So firstly, the most important thing that we have to do when it comes to our homegrown gas production is to protect the North Sea. We are losing jobs as we speak. Thousands and thousands of jobs are being lost in Aberdeen and across the country. This is one of the biggest crises that we're facing in our modern economy because we rely on the North Sea not just for our gas supply, but also for all of those sectors that sit on top of it, whether it's plastics, whether it's chemicals. It is one of the keystones in our modern economy, and that's why you'll see us talking about that so much, because it's very, very important that we make sure that the North Sea doesn't die under this Labour government. I'm going to go to Katie next from The Express.
Thank you. There have been reports that Andy Burnham is putting off an announcement on Rosebank and Jackdaw due to concerns after a summer of heat waves. Is there a problem with optics if he gives it the green light now?
Look, I actually think this is worse than the Ed Miliband position, because Andy Burnham knows that it's right to sign off those two fields. He's just too chicken to do it. And the truth is, the gas that you get from the North Sea has far fewer emissions than the gas that you import from overseas. So it's actually better for climate for us to use our own. Nils Pratley from The Guardian.
Could I ask Ed, the criticism from some of the energy industry? Yeah, the criticism from some of the energy industry is that your plan relies on nuclear being done cheaper than it's ever been done before or recently, and that gas turbines can be built more cheaply than current predictions suggest. I'm just interested in your response.
So on the nuclear front, we do assume some in cost improvement from later builds, which I think is consistent with some of the learning curves in academic literature. I also think it's important that we note that Sizewell B, the last completed PWR in the UK, built under a man called Brian George, was delivered at, I think, a 7-year construction time and just over £5,000 a kilowatt, which is less than half of what Hinkley C is being delivered at. So I slightly reject this, the assumption that we're absolutely sort of guaranteed to keep building at nuclear at high cost. I think the Fingleton Review in particular was a magnificent document in isolating some of the key issues that drive up costs in the nuclear industry, and it's something we'll be working on. On the cost and build times of gas power stations, I think in the report we're assuming more build out sort of slightly later. There's enough firm capacity for now. But yes, if there is still high competition for gas turbines in the sort of 2030s, then the cost will be higher than the report assumes. I think that's fair.
Fantastic. Nick from Politico.
Hi. Previously, when you were Energy Secretary, you said nothing would distract you from your sort of the push towards net zero. What has changed in your thinking? And if it's the case that the sort of civil service kind of bullied you into pushing forward a net zero when you're Energy Secretary, why wouldn't that happen if you have Energy Secretary again after the election?
What a bizarre write-up of what I said today. Look, firstly, I think that was something I said in the weeks in the role, and as you heard me lay out today, what I then did next is go and interrogate those assumptions. I was not bullied by anyone, excuse me, thank you very much. But what I did do is go and ask some serious questions, and when it was clear that they didn't have the evidence, I commissioned the work, because what we need to know is the true costing of renewables so we can make better energy policy. The only reason that work was stopped was because Ed Miliband cancelled it. So perhaps he was bullied. We don't know. Jess from Bloomberg.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks, Ed. Very interesting speech. I just wanted to ask about the timings of the cost reductions and just to kind of clarify the difference between consumer bills and industrial prices, because obviously when we talk about industrial prices energy prices being highest in the world, we're talking about industrial. How quickly would you expect to see energy bills fall significantly? Because Labour also talk about expecting cost reductions within the next 5 to 10 years. So based on your proposals today, how quickly would you see costs fall? I want to just also ask a little bit about the past. Do you think Theresa May was wrong to sign up to the net zero target? And also, if you had been Energy Secretary from 2015 until 2024, what would you have done differently? I'm thinking particularly around grid constraints.
So firstly, we have the highest industrial electricity prices in the developed world. We have the second highest domestic electricity prices in the developed world. So I don't think it's fair to decouple the two. They're high either way you look at it. In terms of the savings, the cheap power pathway that Onward have modelled is a fifth cheaper by 2035 and almost a third cheaper by 2050. And as I said, and as Ed made the point, it still gets its power from 80% clean power sources. I don't think, to your final point, that either Kemi or I have shied away from saying that Conservatives got things wrong in the past. In fact, when Theresa passed that legislation, there were only 2 MPs who spoke up in 2019, and one of them was Kemi. So we're not shying away from the fact that we think things should have been done differently. The next person I have is Charlie Peters.
Hello. Yeah, Charlie Peters, GB News. In her response to this report, the Energy Secretary has said that the Tories are failing to address the climate crisis at a time as wildfires are raging across the UK. The implication there, of course, is that your plans would put lives and livelihoods at risk. In your response to that, do you think that the current energy policy and direction of the government is putting lives and livelihoods at risk this winter if energy prices remain high and people cannot afford to heat their homes?
Look, I think a huge basis of the quality of life of people in this country comes from having affordable energy. Now, in her response, I think that's disappointing because she's not engaging with the facts at all. I thought this was meant to be someone who is coming in with a more pragmatic approach, but only 10% of our emissions are in the power systems. That's what she's focused on. But what she needs to answer is why making our electricity ever more expensive helps with the other 90%, because what you need for that is cheap electricity. That's why I say we are the only people with a plan that can deliver both for the economy and for the environment. Thank you. That was all the questions I had. So thank you very much. Thank you for coming.